Welcome everybody. Hello, my name is Stephen Cranfield. I'm the kind of compere host for this afternoon's session, Researching the Rainbow. This is my third time being invited back here. I really enjoy these sessions. I really enjoy being part of National Student Pride, and it's always a great opportunity for people who are doing research, whether it is by LGTB researchers or about LGTB issues. It's always an interesting forum for exploring some of the innovations, challenges and achievements of student researchers at undergraduate or postgraduate or doctoral level. It's a challenging time for research in the world, as it is for most things generally. I work at an institution called the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which is at the forefront of the global response to many challenges in the world, particularly health-related challenges, things like Ebola, tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS, malaria, and latterly COVID-19. And I think one of the things that you could say about research at the moment is that it is under threat. You wouldn't think so, but it is on a number of fronts, particularly if you think about, for example, the rise of populism and the undermining of truth-telling, the rise of the post-truth society. You have people systematically denigrating experts and being applauded for it. You have widespread denial about the truth and the reality of research findings. Very, very difficult to challenge that when you have the media in some quarters undermining the findings of research. And also you have funding for research, which of course is perilous at the best of times, but my institution, for example, we've seen the challenges of Brexit, we've seen the removal of overseas aid budget, which has cut a lot of our work, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's a great time to sort of consider the challenges of research, but also to think about what research is about. And I think research at whatever level, whether it's undergraduate, postgraduate, or your own individual research that you like to do, it starts with a question, it starts with a willingness to challenge assumptions, to want to challenge the status quo and to make a difference. And I think that's one of the things that will characterize some of the or many presentations we're going to see today. How do we ask a question? How do we pursue it? How do we open up the world to voices that hitherto have been silenced or not listened to or marginalized? How do we individually and collectively make a difference as LGBT researchers, but also about the lives, conditions, aspirations and hopes of LGBT people and those who care for them? So today we have a lineup of 4 researchers, and they are at different kind of stages in their research journey, but they're going to present to us, and they're going to present to us in an extremely challenging way for them, because as happens at most research conferences, the PowerPoint never works. So their carefully prepared presentations are on their phones, but alas, can't be shared with you visually. Now, they're going to make a great effort and great stalwart attempt to present their work kind of as presenters standing in front of you, without the kind of death by PowerPoint that you might associate with traditional research presentations. All power to them, and I hope that you'll be I hope you will be engrossed by what they tell. We're going to do them all individually, one by one. They've got 15 minutes to present their research, and we're then going to take questions afterwards. I'll just briefly introduce them one by one, and we've got...
Hi, I'm Joe.
And next to Joe, we have...
I'm Ashley. Hi.
Hi, I'm Afi.
Afi, and next to Afi...
Hi, I'm Kushi.
And we're going to start off with Joe, and Joe's going to talk to us about his research. And if I can get my phone up here, he's going to talk. Joe's based at the University of Greenwich, and he's going to be talking to us about a project that he did called "Is Pride a Protest?" It's a good question, and he's going to tease out the question and its related answers in relation to the research that he's done. So over to you, Joe. You've got 15 minutes, and I'll give you a 1-minute kind of prod when it's coming up.
Perfect, thank you. So hi everyone. Yeah, I am Joe from the University of Greenwich, and I, as of literally 2 days ago, have just finished my undergraduate dissertation in events management. And doing my dissertation on Pride was really important to me because it was actually volunteering with my local Pride down in Kent, which inspired me to study events management. So it was a nice little full circle moment, which is doing well on LinkedIn with my post yesterday. And I think it was, for me, a really interesting question because working on different Pride events, everyone has an opinion on whether Pride is a protest or not. And it is so difficult to try and get an actual answer. So I was like, you know what? Like, everyone's got their own opinion, but actually, like, looking at it properly. That was worded wrong, but you know what I mean. And the way I did this was looking at it from a multi-stakeholder perspective, so looking at it from attendees, organisers and organisations that interact with Pride to really try to have a concrete definition of whether Pride is or is not a protest. And this covered a lot of different previous theories, so I had to look a lot just on the attendee perspective on characterisations and motivations of both protest and cultural events, which was the sort of the two options of which Pride could be classified as now. And the good thing about that is that the existing motivations and characterizations are so clear cut that it provided a very good sort of set of factors of which the research then could be compared to. So there was that, and then I also explored, there's a lot of research on LGBTQ plus motivations, particularly in a travel and tourism sort of perspective, but a lot of that's really transferable to events. So that was one part of it. And then the next was looking at it from an organizer perspective, and I really focused on event authenticity and event evolution. And a lot of the previous literature I was looking at was exploring past protests which have now evolved into cultural events. And one example of that is Exit in Europe, which started as a student protest and is now one of Europe's biggest music festivals. So that was used as sort of a good case study in my research. And then finally, organisations, and I think this is probably the most debated topic, especially from an events perspective, just because of over-commercialisation of Pride. It's such a heavily written on subject at the moment, so there was a lot to do with that and how organisations interact with Pride, as well as looking at actual wider motivations for organisations just sponsoring events. And then all of that together led me to the creation of what I'm calling the Pride spectrum theory, in which actually Pride can not singularly be either a protest or a cultural event, and that as a whole, Pride is somewhere in between, with individual Pride events being situated somewhere in between, based on a few different factors, mainly situational factors such as the local area of the country it's in and the legislation of that country, as well as then stakeholder factors such as attendee motivations, characterizations, as well as then how the event's designed. So there's a lot of different factors, which means Pride such as maybe London Pride could be more cultural leaning, whereas a Pride in another country could be more protest leaning, rather than singularly one of them. And the way I tested that was, I had 3 different methods. So the first was a survey for attendees, which was really fun, to be fair, and I loved this part, which sort of just was observing there was the list of characterizations of protest events and cultural events, and you had to say which you agreed most to. It was very simple, but it provided some really, really interesting results that I'll get onto a bit. So there was that, and then I also asked demographic factors, because I had a theory that demographic factors would have an influence. So I tested that. And then I also interviewed Pride organisers, which range from small Prides with around 500 attendees to bigger ones with 50,000 plus attendees, ranging sort of from Prides that had been existing for around 3 years to 45 plus. So it was a very diverse range of Prides represented, but they were all UK based. And then there was organisations ranging from 6 employees to 300,000 employees. So it was, again, very diverse, working, some of them internationally, some of them just based in a small town. It was very, So that was definitely my favourite part, was talking to them, just listening to people. And the results it threw out, oh no, nearly skipped that bit. And I think actually the best way to really represent my research is to do a little recreation of it. So I'm going to do the little cringe thing where I make you put your hands up. But essentially, I'm just going to list some motivations of both cultural or protest events, just to see which you agree with. So if you agree that whatever I say describes Pride, just put your hand up. If not, don't put your hand up. So put your hand up if you think Pride, you would describe Pride as being politically motivated. Okay, cool. Would you describe Pride to be an event that fosters inclusion and belonging? Cool. Events that take place in the public sphere? Cool. Places of cultural exchange? Excellent. An event with goals that extend further than the event itself? Cool. And then the last one is just an event with tourism benefits. Lovely. So as a whole, I can tell you that just based on that, most of you would characterise Pride as a protest. And that was actually exactly what I found in my research, was attendees do characterise Pride as a protest, but also an additional characterisation which wasn't in previous literature that was identified as educational, and how Pride is educational in all senses of the word. But the thing that I think was the most interesting was attendees' motivations to attend were more cultural leaning. And as well, they highlighted different motivations that, again, hadn't been in previous research, such as allyship, and I think that's a motivation that is so specific to Pride, so I thought that was incredible just to see those intersections. But also just to observe how attendees characterise Pride as a protest, but then attend as a cultural event. So that really supported my theory of, well, it can't be either one of them because no one can really decide. And I also found that there is demographic impacts, but purely in the sense or on the basis of sexuality and gender identity, not on the basis of age, ethnicity, or location of residence. So that was a really, again, interesting intersection. And an example of that was people who identified as non-binary were much more likely to view Pride as a protest and attend as a protest. So that was attendees. That was just the survey. And then I had the organisers who, I mean, I wasn't shocked by this. Organisers design Pride as both a cultural and a protest event. So that was, again, really useful. But one of the things that was highlighted was how trans rights, particularly at the moment, is a key motivation for Pride being designed as a protest. But there was also a lot of arguments about how it could actually be more beneficial for Pride to be a cultural event due to upcoming protest legislation, so the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill. The implications around protest logistics actually might mean it's more beneficial for Pride to be viewed as a cultural event, so that it doesn't have to try to deal with that piece of legislation, essentially. And then the last thing that was really identified through organisers was methods of authenticity and how that's upheld within the event, and how actually the two that were identified was education and workshops on LGBTQ+ history, as well as community engagement and co-creation of Pride, are two of the best methods to hold authenticity to Pride origins. So Stonewall riots and those early Pride marches, which actually then creates actionable recommendations for organisers. And then finally, organisations. It was, from my research at least, it showed that organisations mainly do actually sponsor Pride for philanthropic reasons, and that's sort of shown through a lack of financial return on investment objectives that you typically find with event sponsorship of cultural events. So that was a good just thing of showing that maybe organisations don't view Pride as a cultural event, but they also don't think of it as a protest. And that was clear that nearly all of the organisations said that they wouldn't interact with protest events. And that was mainly on issues such as brand image and being perceived as political, and that sort of wanting to avoid organisations being perceived as political. But again, the thing I found most interesting was organisations have now included LGBTQ+ issues within culture, with their work culture, so much that it's institutionalised Pride. And that sort of contradicts key characterisations of protest events. So that was just by organisations being inclusive to LGBTQ+ people, which is obviously incredible, but that sort of stops Pride being a protest, potentially just straight off the bat. And as I said, this research has two main implications at the moment. The first is that it provides actionable ways for organisers to design Pride events that are authentic and meet the needs of attendees while staying true to the message of Pride. Whereas it also has sort of further research implications of, okay, now we understand those are the two main ways of keeping authenticity, but are they working? And that's something I want to look into in the future, is doing more research into attendees and if that authenticity of Pride is held, as well as doing more research of specific Pride events to really test that spectrum theory even further. So that's me done.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you. Next, we have Kushi Grover, who is at London School of Economics, and Kushi is going to talk to us about queer Indian women experiences and the media.
Hi everyone, I'm Kushi. I'm an LSE student. I'm studying MSc Social and Cultural Psychology. So growing up in India, I'm a bisexual woman, and I've never identified with the kind of notion that to feel proud of my identity, that I would have to come out to people. And kind of like when I got into psychology and started researching, I found out that most of the literature kind of keeps verbal disclosure or coming out as a part of accepting yourself or of being gay. So I really wanted to look into how this process plays out for people who aren't white. So that's where I come in. So my research kind of talked about how queer women in India perceive coming out and how media representation kind of has a role to play in it. So the current literature kind of like posits that coming out is an important part of being proud of your identity. And if you don't come out, it's kind of associated with guilt, with shame. But however, a lot of research has kind of noted how these theories, specifically the one that goes back, Cass, in 1994, it was done on Australians, particularly white gay men, and how these theories don't really apply to people of color because instead of giving an acceptance from those around you, it kind of like ostracizes you from both your cultural community, but also the gay community. Similarly, if we kind of look at it from the South Asian perspective, a lot of people from India, when they came back to India after living in the UK and the United States, they wanted to bring these concepts of the terms that we use, LGBTQIA, and the term coming out to India. Well, India has a thriving gay community. Trans individuals have been prevalent in India and worshipped since the Mughal times. However, these terms were new and were not accepted because being gay was seen as a white disease. So South Asian academics worried that if we do bring Eurocentric terms to India, it would kind of like push us back in progress. So going back to media, media representation is getting better for LGBTQ characters. However, the representation is again predominantly white. I did have some statistics to show you, but I don't have any PPT yet. So 74% of characters were white. And if we kind of go into gender identity, most of those characters, I think 73% were men. So kind of like if the public population kind of picks up on what media is representing, then the narrative of being gay as, being something that's unnatural for people of color or natural specifically for women, it's kind of furthered by the media. The absence of LGBTQ identifying women further kind of adds that women who aren't gay aren't legitimate. Like sapphic love isn't seen as important as other kinds of other forms of love, and queer women, even when they are portrayed, they're portrayed in a very specific manner. So there was this research for Indian media portrayals, and the way they described it was sexting the sisterhood. So women, loving women were only showed as kind of like, oh, they're friends, they have to be best friends, or in women-specific spaces, or only as like, conjugal neglect, so a wife kind of turns to your sister-in-law. So all of those representations were very stereotypical and not really benefiting the community at all. So what I wanted to study was how queer women perceive coming out and these representations. So this was a project that I did for my methodology class. And because it was a small project, I couldn't do something high risk, and interviewing gay people is high risk. So I had to turn to focus groups. I did a focus group with 6 women residing in the UK and India, but mostly residing in India. They're aged 20 to 23. And we discussed what we think coming out means, how we feel about coming out, what the process entails, and specifically how representation of coming out differs in the West and in India. So I used 2 clips. I used a clip from Atypical, the scene where, how many people have seen Atypical? Okay, quite a few. So there's this scene in season 4 where Cassie tells her dad that, hi, I'm bisexual. And her dad is like, okay, what should I do about that? And she's like, oh, did your mom know? Yeah. Did your brother know? Yeah. Did the mailman know? Yes. Like, why, like kind of like, why am I the last person to know? And the second clip was from a very mainstream Indian movie, Bollywood movie. It's called Ek Ladki Ko Dekha To Aisa Laga. So it was a play on a really old song. And in the movie, they don't show them being intimate. They don't show them really engaging in anything. They don't use the terms lesbian, gay, anything. And she doesn't come out. The main character is outed by her brother, and then it takes place in a place of conflict. So kind of I wanted to use those clips to kind of prime the participants and then have a discussion about that. So my findings kind of like, I had this hour-long discussion with these women, and what I wanted to know what coming out means to them, but what I got was so much more. And the main theme of what came out of those discussions was that coming out and queerness is misrepresented. So the themes that came from my findings was inadequate representation, the process of disclosure, and cultural context. I have some quotes that I would like to share that I thought were very interesting. So when they talked about the process of disclosure, they talked about how they have to think a lot about it. They were like mixed opinions. Some people were like, oh, I just told my friends because I needed to get this out of me. Like I realized, I identified what I'm feeling and I need to tell everyone ASAP. Whereas other people had recently come out to their family, to their friends, because they thought that once they would come out, it would be permanent, it would be concrete, and people wouldn't take them seriously if they messed up. So one of the quotes that I really liked was, I think before the process of coming out itself, there's a whole backstory of all backgrounds. Consuming a lot of information and processing, it's tedious and a long process for me. So this participant wanted to engage in a lot of theory and a lot of background, learning about everything they could, to being absolutely sure that they identified before taking up space. On the other hand, the other person was, you have to said that, kind of like it was something that I need to get out of me. I needed to get it out. So the first person I told was someone at college. And then I kind of looked back and realized maybe I shouldn't have done that because I wasn't sure of what I wanted to do. An interesting thing that I found was the hesitance in coming out to male figures in their life, whether it would be peers, their brothers, their father, because this quote kind of sums it up. Saying that I'm queer to my father makes it a problem, or any male person in the family, or even friends, making it so hard for me because I know they will immediately sexualize me. So kind of like all of the women in the group kind of agreed that it became a problem because they so desperately did not want to be seen as a trope. One thing to note here, all of these women identified as bisexual, which was a coincidence, but then a discussion kind of further ensued to kind of state how previous partners who were mostly straight kind of only talked, when they did come out to those partners, they always brought up the terms, like, let's have a threesome, right? Or, oh, that's so cool. Or it's just a phase, it doesn't really matter. So those kind of tropes were something that these women were very scared of and hence did not want to come out to people around them. The second thing that we talked about was cultural context. We talked a lot about how coming out means something very different in the West as it does in India. So where society and family hold so much value, and it's even if that family and society might not be accepting, we do hold very strong roots and connection to those. So we kind of talked about how the language that we use to come out is very different in India. Even if our parents might be accepting of the LGBTQ community in general, they might not be accepting of their children being a part of the community. Some often, like as I said in the beginning, kind of like a lot of people term being gay as a white disease, something that's not in Indian culture, something that's imported. And one participant kind of talked about this when they said, I remember having a conversation with my uncle, and he said, all of this is so westernized. It's so uncommon here, and it's not meant for our country or culture. So these recurring notions of queerness being alien, being Western, kind of not belonging for Indian culture is also like represented in the lack of media, because all the media, so for context, all of these women were mostly from urban India, and in urban India, a lot of Western content is also consumed, and not a lot of LGBTQ characters in Indian media. So kind of the notion becomes then that queerness is a white concept, it is a Western concept, because if it was an Indian concept, it would be in the media. Hence that point comes in that even though families might have acceptance, they might not have the same terms that we are so used to hearing in media, in the people around us. So this participant talked about how families might have the words, the right words for acceptance, but they may not express it. It's just that the West and the English language, specifically in America and the UK, they have the words for acceptance that we're used to, but we don't have the same words. So even though parents might be accepting, might want to learn, we just don't associate that with acceptance because we're so used to the mainstream Eurocentric acceptance that has been taught to us. Another very important factor was considering culture. There was this study done in 2016 for people of color, how verbal disclosure wasn't something that they did, but they kind of expressed their identity and came out to those around them through gestures or through clothing. So not verbal disclosure as such, but disclosure to some extent. And this participant talks about this, that my identity is very inherently also part of my culture. And because of my upbringing, that takes a front seat, which is very common in people of color, how their ethnic identity is more important than their queer identity, because staying, especially in the UK or in America, where you become an ethnic minority, it becomes very important for you to stay a part of those communities rather than getting yourself ostracized from everywhere. That's specifically why I wanted to study Indians in India, because they're not an ethnic minority, and hence I wanted to see how that kind of research might play out in a place where you're a majority. The last place, we looked at the clips. We looked at the clips and we discussed how the clips differ. Because these were urban Indians, they consumed both content, they were familiar with both clips, and hence then we started talking about how the representation in Atypical, how Cassie's father was so accepting, and Cassie openly came out to her father, compared to the second clip where she was outed, she was forced, she was called, she was shamed in front of a large audience. One clip kind of summarizes one quote summarizes what the clips were. The first clip, it's almost as if she was outed, whereas in the second clip, she came out on her own volition. The first clip, she's doing it because she's backed into a corner. The theme of autonomy and kind of free will came into play here, as to how much privacy is given to individuals. In South Asia, kind of like your business is everyone's business because you live in South Asia. And the society is just that if something happens, because for women, you are the honor of the family. So it becomes even more, rules become even more stringent for you in that sense. So kind of how you are the honor and pride of the family. So if you go beyond any of the norms that are put into place, it's on you to kind of regain that honor. And not being straight kind of violates most of the norms right out the door. So kind of how you have to, okay. The last kind of quote that I wanted to say was, do we want representation or do we want good representation? While gay men are more and more visible in terms of romance, love, and affection, queer women are never given that space in media. So I just want to sum up and talk about what I found from the research. First, Indian queer identities don't neatly fall under the LGBTQ spectrum. Queerness has always been viewed as a Western concept, and there has been disappointment from friends and family. There's been hesitance in coming out to men. But a really nice finding that I did get, that all of them felt that coming out was something that made them feel proud, made them feel that their identity was official, and gave them a sense of understanding and acceptance. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kushi. Thank you for that. And next we have Afi Gover from the University of Sussex, who's going to discuss with us his research on how capitalism shapes non-normative queer relationships.
Yes, hello, I'm Afi. My pronouns are he, him. I'm from the University of Sussex in my final year studying my sociology BA. Yeah, I just talk a little bit about my dissertation research and sort of the things I found from that so far. It's not a big project, but I just wanted to sort of share a little bit about the conclusions I've been able to come to from the data that I've collected so far. So non-normative relationships. If you don't know what I mean by that, that's absolutely fine. Essentially, it's broadening the term queer to sort of incorporate other, well, non-normative styles of relationship. So for the purposes of this study, that includes queer relationships, T for T or trans for trans relationships, polyamorous relationships, and various forms of ethical non-monogamy, and also just queer relationships in general. So this just came out of a personal interest in the community. I'm involved in a lot of the communities that I am studying, and I am a strong believer in research coming from within the community rather than externally. And also there was just a gap in the literature surrounding love and capitalism concerning queer and other diverse identities. Yeah, that was just what motivated me to do this study. I did have a quote here in my beautiful PowerPoint presentation, but I can just summarize the gist of it. It's essentially a quote from Sheehan 2016, where he claims that romance is the building block from which to start a family. And I disagree with this, and I'm going to go on to disagree with this throughout the presentation, because it's kind of saying that romance is a necessary prerequisite to start a family, which it isn't. And it's also suggesting that people fall in love because they want to start a family, which again is just not true in all cases. So a couple of the theories I looked at were Anthony Giddens and Eva Illouz, who, interesting enough, independently identified this sort of concept of pure versus traditional love in their own studies. It was Giddens' sort of original idea, but I think Illouz sort of managed to touch on it without realizing it in her work. So there's this idea of traditional love, which is a sort of chivalrous, straight relationship with your beautiful gender power dynamics, and it lasts forever, and you have lots of babies, and the wife stays at home and looks after the kids. And then we have this idea of pure love, which is a sort of contemporary, modern idea of love, which is sort of, he describes it as selfish, he describes it as self-serving, and he suggests that it comes with lots of anxieties and also, interestingly, a predisposition to addiction for some reason. He thinks if you are in an equal relationship with your partner, you're more likely to get into gambling or something like that. There was a follow-up study done on this, and they found that it absolutely was not true. All the positive effects of being in a pure love relationship could be identified, whereas all the negative ones were just not there. And if you want more information in the study, please come find me after the show, because I cannot remember it off the top of my head. It's by Grayson Simmons. I can't remember the year, but yeah, if anyone's interested, let me know. Yeah, so that was just a little bit of background context about the study. So a little bit onto the methodology. So I had two different kinds of different research methods, essentially. The first of which was some archival research at the Keep in Brighton. I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with the Keep, but it's essentially a huge building full of a bunch of old documents, and they do this thing called the Mass Observation Archive, which is really, really cool. Essentially, locals take part in this sort of biannual survey. They'll send out questions relating to random topics about anything, and people will write back anonymously and share their opinions on the topics. There was a directive sent out in summer of 1990 on close relationships, which was really, really useful for my study. I, again, had a really beautiful slide with a bunch of quotes from this directive, but unfortunately I don't have that with me today. But as you can imagine, there was a varying scope of hot takes that people had back in 1990 about non-normative relationships, especially concerning gay relationships on the tail end of the AIDS crisis. A lot of the people who were participating in the observations were older, so their opinions, even then, a lot of them were quite dated. But there were glimmers of nice things coming through, and a lot of ideas about marriage being something that people feel the need to conform to. That was a sentiment that was kind of echoed in more contemporary rhetoric. which takes us to the main body of my research, which was a series of in-depth interviews. I spoke to 8 individuals in a course of 7 interviews. One of them was as a couple, which was really lovely. And I essentially structured this based around the thematic findings I found through the archival research. So I asked them questions relating to all manner of things: politics, religion, their definitions of family and romance, and I even asked the questions from the director at the end of the interview just to sort of compare how they, how the views from 1990 held up. And it obviously, as you can imagine, very, very different responses in both those cases. In the interviews, I identified 6 key themes that were recurring. The main one of these, interestingly, was neurodivergence and disability in general, but particularly neurodivergence, particularly ADHD and autism. There seems to be quite a big overlap between neurodivergence and the LGBT community, especially the trans community. And I believe that this, the lack of a social script that is required in some non-normative relationships appeals greatly to people who are neurodivergent quite often. There was also this theme of something called relationship anarchy that a lot of the polyamorous participants brought up. It was really interesting that every single person who I spoke to identified as left-leaning. More than half of my participants identified as anarchists, which was, again, a really interesting thing to pick up on. And I think they wanted to embody a personal politic in their relationships and in the way they structure their communities, which I thought was a really nice and interesting finding. It also ties into this idea of chosen family that also came up quite often. I think a lot of the time people in non-normative relationships might not have a supportive biological family. They might not be in contact. And even if they are, a lot of the time people do choose to create a chosen family based around this shared set of experiences. And that again ties into the idea of community, which is another theme that came up, especially this concept of mutual aid and community aid and people setting up these communities based around shared experiences to help each other when they are existing under a government who won't. The idea of marriage was quite contested. There were varying views amongst participants. I had some participants who were engaged, and I had some participants who are very anti-assimilation, saw marriage as very much a cis-het, monogamous, very normative institution they didn't want to be a part of. There's also the matter of the fact that equal marriage does not exist for a lot of people I studied. Trans people can't get married unless they have a gender recognition certificate, which is very hard to come by if they want to be registered as their legal gender on their marriage certificate. Disabled people often can't get married without losing out on benefits. Polyamorous people can't marry more than one partner as it stands in the UK. So yeah, there are a lot of diverging opinions around that. And then finally, this sort of false dichotomy of platonic and romantic relationships. I think a lot of the people in non-normative relationships, particularly polyamorous communities, don't see a need to differentiate between platonic friendship and romantic relationship. They see it more as a sort of sliding scale, or they just don't feel the need to categorize people in this way, which, yeah, it was really lovely to hear about people's personal experiences, and people are very excited to talk about their partners, as you can imagine. It's generally a really, really lovely topic to interview people about. So generally the conclusions I've drawn, I have 2 separate conclusions I've drawn from the results so far. These are sort of exchanges that carry on analyzing my research data. But the first of these is that non-normative relationships are typically formed by people who are already minorities, who are already struggling under capitalism. And as a result, people in non-normative relationships often will create communities based around mutual aid to combat this. Yes, so that is all I have to say on the topic. But if anyone wants to hear, if anyone needs like the sources or anything like that, I do have them. They're just not here currently. But yeah, feel free to chat to me afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks, Effie. You did a great job of summarising that and bringing in the felt, the texture of the kind of interviews that you had. Just before, because you've got a couple of more minutes if you wish, would you like to add anything about the capitalism aspect of it, because that was the title of one of my main focuses, and you touched on it at the end.
Yes.
Could you add a bit about that?
Yes. So I think this concept of minority stress comes into play here, and this concept of it is the fact that people who are in non-normative relationships are often either LGBT or various other minorities, like I touched on, disabled. And I'm sure everyone here is aware of the struggles that living in a wealth-oriented society can bring, especially if you're already subject to other struggles. Majority of my participants were trans. They struggled to afford private healthcare, which is inaccessible through the NHS as it stands. My disabled participants were struggling with, they were telling me all about how their relationships affect their PIP and their income from not being able to work. And yeah, it's all these intersecting and compounding factors that mean that these individuals that I spoke to are especially struggling to thrive in a capitalistic society. But the fact that people who are in these styles of relationships form local communities, or at least they do in Brighton. I think a potential area for further research is to look more widely throughout the UK, because Brighton is obviously a very unique and different social space. But yes, at least within Brighton, people who are in these kinds of relationships, they will meet up at there's like an event called New Love Brighton, which is like an alternative dating event, and these people meet at these events and they create their own communities and they create mutual aid and they create there's like Reclaim Pride Brighton is one that some of my partners are involved in. I think it is this motivation to care for a community that has been rejected under capitalism that motivates people. Yeah.
No, thanks very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, on to our final presenter, who is Ashley Nicole, based at Goldsmiths in South London. And Ashley's going to talk to us about digestible queer culture, LGBT plus teen movies in the mainstream. Over to you, Ashley.
Thank you. So I'm going to skip over some of the slides that are based on images from the films. But my undergraduate research was basically summed up by this quote, which was, "Those with few or no connections to others like themselves rely heavily on the media to find out about what eventually will become their chosen communities." This is a quote from Peter Lang. So the term digestible queer culture, which is the title of this project, was coined by myself. Basically, when I was looking at all the films that I wanted to explore, or possible films I wanted to explore, I noticed that overall in the groups of them, the stories of queer people are slightly adjusted depending on who makes the films. So the way that I define queer culture is the ways in which queer culture is adjusted to accommodate a non-queer audience in addition to queer audiences. So before I talk about the film that I've looked at, I'll briefly talk about queer cinema. So the origins of queer cinema largely stem from the AIDS crisis. Obviously, during this time, art was used a lot as an outlet, not just for emotions, but also as a source of protesting. And film was actually used for this. So you have the queer cinema festivals, which created a space for queer people in an age where community spaces were in high demand, just because of the political atmosphere. So you've also got, in the same similar time set, whilst you have this demand for queer culture and queer spaces to do with creativity, you've also got Hollywood, who are running very much against this. One interesting thing I found was actually that Hollywood had this kind of lavender marriage, which was the title. Basically, they had a few actors, or maybe more, obviously because of this whole cover-up. We don't know how many people were actually queer or not, but they would allow them to act in Hollywood films as long as they had a cover-up relationship and appeared straight. Often this was written into their contracts because it was basically a way to secure them in this contract, a monetary contract, so they wouldn't go against it. One of the most famous people at the moment who was in one of these lavender marriages was actually William Haynes. He ended up leaving acting for his partner. It was originally written into his contract, and when it finished, he left and didn't go back to acting. So obviously after Stonewall, sort of the discrimination lessened a tiny bit, but I think it's largely agreed that it's kind of wavering. It's not so defined. Modern representation is definitely a lot better than it was then, in terms of when you compare it to the fact that people were made to have fake marriages. So I situate LGBT content slightly outside the mainstream. You often see it filtered into mainstream, and this is largely sort of promoted by Netflix and like streaming services and the access to international film outside of the UK or wherever you're situated. It's a lot easier to access queer media. A quote by Shari is that the past 2 years have produced a significant increase in the number of diverse teen films. And this was written in 1997, so you can imagine that obviously it's increased a fair bit since then. You've got films like Moonlight who have won awards, Call Me Up By Your Name, which have won awards. And you've also got RuPaul's Drag Race, which started from a very low budget production that wasn't really seen or imagined to reach the endless potential that it has now and the endless spin-offs. So I looked at Love, Simon as my film. It's a teen film centered around a boy who is gay, and the whole theme of the film is that he comes out. It's also set in high school. It's featured around his life in high school. It's directed by a gay man as well. So the way that this utilizes the sort of theme of digestible queer culture is it used cliche settings such as the fairground, high school, which you've all seen in other films before. So you've seen it in Grease, Stranger Things, and many other ones that have come out since. By situating it in a familiar space that you've seen in media before, it allows directors to feed in different stories, and it seems less abrasive to a non-queer audience seeing, obviously, in Love, Simon, when you've got the kiss scene at the end, it seems less like in your face if you've sort of led them in a sort of storyline that they recognize. So they recognize that it's a high school story. It's got a very similar setup to many, many teen films that you've seen before, which you can see as like it can be seen as a very tropey thing to do and something that isn't very creative. There's a whole argument of whether do you want good queer film or do you want just queer film to be able to be whatever it is. Like, I would argue that it's kind of better to have a wider range of films and just media in general, good and bad, because at least you're allowed the space to have that, rather than only promoting the best of the best, because that creates like a pressure in of itself of, do you have the money to even achieve that, or are you even allowed to reach that? So you've got the fairground scene. You've also got the classic coming out scene, which is another one that is sort of recognized by non-queer audiences as something. It belongs to the same language as like what people recognize as queer like stories. It's a familiar thing. This is another thing where it's brought up a lot of sort of not negative, but rather just a critique of it, of whether every queer film needs a coming out scene, because obviously some people don't come out. Some people you come out, but it's not as important as other events in your life. But yeah, basically the conclusion of this is that digestible queer culture, so when you see films that obviously are dialed down a bit, or they've had things that are omitted, or you can see that they have followed a very like common tropes to create a queer film that is also that reaches cinema. It's a powerful tool for acceptance, I think, because if you have films like this who they're produced in order to reach the cinema, it kind of paves the way for other films to like feed in and then follow that. And then I would say that once you've sort of created that little pathway, you are allowing other stories that are a bit more like not outrageous but different, and ones that maybe like to a mainstream audience won't be as successful, but they have that opportunity to reach the same levels just by sort of feeding it in. And also, much like there are bad films of all genres, good ones alike, I would say that queer people deserve a wide range of bad, good, trashy, and cinematic films and TV shows to choose from, just like everyone else does. It's this diversity in film which queer cinema is heading towards, which is making mainstream at the moment and hopefully will continue to develop. And that is why I looked out for my undergraduate dissertation.
Thank you. Thank you to all four presenters, and I'm going to invite questions, but I'll just briefly summarise or just briefly mention what they've talked about. Joe started us off by talking about a piece of work that he's done based on a survey and interview, looking at what would you say, and looking at this issue about what counts as an authentic organisation of a Pride event. And he posed this question, didn't he, around protest or culture or both or somewhere in between, and he came up with this suggestion that there's a kind of spectrum between the two, and he suggested that by the end that there was potential here to provide some way of helping organisers of Pride events to think about how to manage those dichotomies, if they are dichotomies, or whether they can complement each other. So that was Joe's work. I hope that's a fair summary. Kushi then talked about her work based on a focus group looking at media representations of coming out, using a group of South Asian women, and she explored issues with that group around bisexuality, coming into visibility, and you'd use the kind of stimulus trigger of a media representation to foster a conversation and discussion around the complexities and intersectionalities of people's identities, and also this kind of challenging of cultural assumptions and teasing those out, and in fact enriching our understanding of not just the language, but also the visual representation, and also the things like bodily gestures and clothing, all the kind of cultural repertoire of tools by which we try to communicate and establish relationships and identities with others. Afi then took us through his research, which kind of combined archival work and in-depth interviews with a number of people in his locality. It's interesting that you mentioned the mass observation survey there, Afi, because that started, I think, in the 1930s. Did it? I think it was. And it was a major tool for opening up the reality to to people who'd never really understood what the working or the life of work, particularly working class people, was about, because the mass observation people just went around and talked to people, and just asked them about, what do you think about this, without any kind of ostensible hidden agenda, but they compiled a mass of really interesting data. And I think it's fascinating that you went back to that data, because it's there. We should be going back to it, looking at what people said at various points in time, and you used that as a kind of comparator, didn't you, between what's happening now with a very different group of people compared to what people were thinking, saying, and doing at that time. So an interesting comparative study there, looking at and coming up with some ideas for further research. So an excellent opportunity there that you seized on what was there, both in what was there to look at in an archive, but also what was there in your local community. And Ashley, the most recent one was looked at kind of a media study project exploring representations of of teen LGBT teens in films, and I suppose took us through a kind of potted history of LGBT representations in cinema, from classic Hollywood times through to the AIDS crisis, where things really started becoming a bit more authentic, so to speak, and then looking at a kind of almost like a niche market in LGBT youth cinema. And it's interesting when you reflect on how in the United States, for example, and in places in Europe, access of young teenage people to representations of LGBT experience are being closed off. You know, you've got libraries in the US refusing to stock LGBT novels for teenagers. It's coming out of the curriculum. You've got Hungary, which is saying, you know, there should be trigger warnings placed on bookstores that hold LGBT literature for children. So again, you know, how we represent the LGBT experience and how young people access that is a really, really important issue. And, you know, it's not going away, and it's going to become more important. So again, I think it was interesting that you finished your discussion with, you know, arguing that whatever our perceptions of these products as aesthetic objects, or whether they tell the truth, they can be potentially useful tools for acceptance. They kind of open the door to allow more authentic representations of experience in, so that, you know, we don't want that door shut on the foot if we can possibly help it. So that's those four researchers: Joe, Kushi, Afi, and Ashley. So over to questions now, please. And I think, do we have a microphone to give people? We don't have a microphone, so if I go round with the microphone, and then if anyone would like to ask a question.
Obviously, you all looked on different research, different questions, different topics, but I was wondering how much of the academic research you did was by queer academics, and from what years, for example, if you were, you know, really choosing between, like, okay, this article is really interesting and is looking at interesting points, but is not by a queer academic. And also, if you are continuing in your research, I would be really interested in that. And also, actually, sorry, you were studying what subject? I didn't get that.
So I studied my undergrad in illustration. I had a unit in visual cultures, which is where the film came from. I studied under the cult film sort of subsection in that, and that's where my dissertation came from. I study a master's at Goldsmiths at the moment in contemporary art theory.
By the way, amazing research by all of you.
Cool. So I'll go first. If I'm honest, I've got no idea how much of the literature I used was by queer academics. I would probably say not a lot, just because most of the research I was using came from sort of articles on protest or cultural events as a whole. So I don't even know where to guess. And then the second question was if I'm going to carry on the research, was it? Yeah. Hopefully. Yeah. Fingers crossed.
Personally, I'd say the majority of the research I looked at least post-2000s, was by queer researchers. That is probably because I'm in sociology, so it's not exactly too hard to come by. That being said, I wouldn't completely disregard any studies that weren't from queer researchers, though I would be skeptical of their motivations, personally. And in terms of future research, I'm going on to do a master's next year, hopefully going to be looking more at the intersections between transness and disability and focusing more on that.
So personally, most of the research that I looked at, because this was a smaller project, most of the resources were pre-2000, and those researchers were not queer. The most latest one that I looked at was in 2016. That was by a group of queer, I think this was based in Mexico. So that was a really good research. I am continuing this research, so I wanted to do this full-fledged last semester, but I wasn't allowed to, so now I'm doing it in my master's dissertation, kind of using in-depth interviews to look at more, not just about the coming out process and not in media representations, but yes.
I think I'm the same. So I tend to flick between finding older sources and then trying to find the newest ones, and just flicking between the two. I think because I look at media art, it's a little bit easier than it is. I'm not sure. I feel like there's just loads of random articles, and the really neat articles that I can find that have been published in the last couple of years. But I think if you can balance it out, it's quite good. If it's something that you struggle with, I know that you can filter it on Google Scholar by the years. And then I think as long as you balance them out, I wouldn't worry too much about it all being old or all being new. If you've got like a balance between it. I think I'm the same as well with knowing the backgrounds of the people who I'm sourcing of. I'm unsure of most of the time, apart from if they are from like the queer academic side of it. I tend to look at and base a lot of my essays with queer theory, which I think helps a lot. And I'm kind of hoping that a lot of them are queer. So that's how I've got about it.
It's certainly an interesting development, isn't it, to LGBT research compared to past decades where we have the opportunity to reflect on our sources, but also to critique our sources, because even if including when we draw on researchers from our own community, we can disagree, agree, or partly agree, and engage in dialogue with them. So with that kind of independent critical thinking, that, and in a way, I think which our community fosters, away from groupthink, is a very interesting development. I'll take you, and then you.
Thank you. This was specifically for Joe. I thought it was really interesting how you were talking about how sort of different people can conceive of Pride as both a protest and not. I was wondering if you ever ran into any situations where people conceiving of the same event differently caused any sort of conflict, or whether it really necessarily mattered how different people were conceiving the same event. So perhaps something of it, if some people were conceiving it as a cultural event, like organisers, or protest, but then organisations involved might think of it as a cultural event, whether that sort of has caused any clashes from, like an organisational perspective.
I didn't find any huge examples of that massively. I think that there definitely, when there is that sort of conflict of interest, it definitely has had issues, and I think that can be seen with sort of like counter protests against Pride, such as like the Reclaim Pride movement. It's Pride, but it's critiquing Pride as it is, and it's that. So yes, in that sort of sense, where there was definitely disagreement, and there was definitely people who felt strongly about it, but I didn't find any huge influence. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
And we've got time for one more question, because apparently everyone's packing up, but just take one more.
Okay, so I was going to go for individual questions, but then I suppose with a lot of them, it seems. Well, I'm trying to think how can I form all of your questions into one. I think it seems like you're looking at individual groups within LGBTQ, but I was going to say I think it seems that a lot of it is like LGBTQ. There is a bias or a benefit towards white cisgender gay men out of the group compared to all the others. And if you look at queer research in particular, it is literally that group. It is white gay men who largely are the only people looked at, and then generalized to the rest of them. So how well do you think then the background research actually reflects what you're trying to look at?
So I specifically encountered this issue, and that's why I wanted to do the research that I'm doing, because even when I was looking for sources for specifically South Asians, even if it was South Asian men, it was like maybe 2 sources that I found, and they were all pre-2000s. So finding literature about anything that doesn't have anything to do with gay white men is really difficult, and hopefully there will be more in the upcoming years, because there definitely has been more emerging from the global south. So hopefully there will be more in the future, but as of now, there's most of the background literature on all queer theory is just Eurocentric. So yeah.
For me, there was, in my research collected, there was definitely a massive overrepresentation of white people. which is a stated limit. They're like, it wasn't the best in terms of ethnic diversity. But for me, actually, I had a stronger female sort of response than male. So I guess, gender identity diversity was actually really strong. I think it was around 35% identified as male, maybe 40 off the top of my head. So I think that part of it, my research was biased in the sense that it was definitely very white. But I was pleased that it wasn't very just white gay man, because there was a lot of previous research. One of the only other bits of research looking into motivations to attend Pride was done solely on gay white men, and it just infuriated me. So that was something I tried as much as I could to sort of negate and to not do. So yeah.
I think I'm writing an essay at the moment on a queer artist who is trans non-binary, and I think finding supporting like publications for that and just theory to back up my like how I look at their art, it's a lot more difficult than it was with my undergrad dissertation. The reasons that you've like highlighted, it's a lot more difficult to find like research that's based in trans just experience in general. There's a lot on like the AIDS crisis and stuff like that. I found that with the films as well, which was one of the points that I was looking like when it's sort of how my dissertation came into existence, is there's a lot of films about the AIDS crisis which are just very sad, and that sort of like counterbalanced all the other films. So I find it is definitely a struggle, but optimistically I'm thinking that in the next couple of years, that because research is more saturated, that it will sort of tip on the scales a bit and we'll have a bit more access to a wider range of different identities within research.
Yeah, I'll just answer super quickly because I know everyone's keen to rush off. But yes, I think the body of my more contemporary literature that I looked at was from specifically within trans studies, area of queer studies, which personally I found to be a lot more diverse in a range of ways. And it's obviously still quite white dominated, unfortunately. And yeah, this is something that I definitely looked at a lot when I was researching for my study. But unfortunately, it's very hard to find literature on niche topics that aren't written by white people. It's just quite difficult to come across. And yeah, I definitely agree with you in the sense that hopefully in the coming years, we are going to have a generation of academics who are going to be up and coming that are able to talk to these niches and speak from their own experiences. Yes.
I would say you will be the new generation of
yes, hopefully.
As well, as a doctoral student, one thing I could say, because it's so niche, you get published in Parker.
Exactly, you get it.
I'd just like to say that if you would like to contact the researchers who presented this afternoon, seize the opportunity now to ask them if they would like to share their contact details with you so that you can get in touch with them, because I'm not quite sure whether we'll have your contact details on whatever's made available afterwards. So do make the opportunity now. And if you're here, will you be staying around? Please do feel free to talk to the researchers about their work and about to share your own work if you're doing anything similar or different, or would like to pick their brains. But I'd like to thank our 4 researchers here again for sharing their work under challenging circumstances, but it just goes to show how much you can communicate your research if you're passionate about it and you know it, and you know that you want to communicate it to a group of interested people. So I think I'd like to particularly congratulate you on rising to the challenge of not having PowerPoints, but just talking so articulately and passionately about your research, and to thank you very much for coming along today.